The autumn rain fell like tears from heaven itself, each drop carrying the weight of broken dreams and shattered promises. In the small town of Cedar Falls, Texas, the year 1892 had brought nothing but hardship to those who dared to hope for better days. The muddy streets reflected the gray October sky, and the sound of water dripping from weathered rooftops created a melancholy symphony that seemed to echo the collective sorrow of a community struggling to survive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Thompson pulled her worn woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped carefully along the wooden sidewalk, her rounded belly making each step require extra consideration. At 7 months pregnant, every movement had become deliberate, every breath a reminder of the precious life growing within her. The rain had caught her unprepared during her trip to Henderson's general store, and now she hurried toward the shelter of home, her heart heavy with more than just the burden of carrying her late husband's child. It had been 3 months since Thomas died in that terrible accident at the lumber mill. 3 months since her world had crumbled like autumn leaves beneath her feet. The small savings they had managed to accumulate over their 2 years of marriage was nearly gone, spent on doctor bills and funeral arrangements. The cottage they rented on the outskirts of town would soon be beyond her means, and the reality of raising a child alone in such uncertain times pressed upon her shoulders like the weight of the gray clouds above. As Emma navigated around a particularly deep puddle that had formed where the wooden planks had warped from age and weather, she heard something that made her pause. Above the gentle percussion of raindrops and the distant rumble of thunder, there came a sound so raw and heartbreaking that it cut through the evening air like a knife through silk. It was the sound of a grown man weeping, deep sobs that spoke of a pain too profound for words. Emma's steps slowed as she followed the sound, her maternal instincts already awakening despite the child within her womb still having weeks before making its entrance into the world. She found herself drawn toward the narrow alley between Morrison's feed store and the old barber shop, where the overhanging roof created a small shelter from the persistent rain. There, hunched against the brick wall with his face buried in his hands, sat a man whose broad shoulders shook with each sob that escaped his chest. Even in the dim light of the overcast evening, Emma could see that this was no ordinary drifter or town drunk seeking shelter from the storm. His clothes, though soaked through and mud-stained, bore the quality of fine craftsmanship. His boots, despite being scuffed and worn, were made of genuine leather that spoke of better days. Most telling of all was the silver belt buckle that caught what little light filtered through the gray afternoon, engraved with intricate patterns that suggested both prosperity and pride. Jake Mitchell had been sitting in that alley for the better part of 2 hours, ever since he had walked out of the Cedar Falls bank for the final time. The papers in his coat pocket, now damp from the rain that had seeped through the fabric, contained the legal documentation of his complete financial ruin. Silver Creek Ranch, the 2,000 acres of prime Texas grazing land that had been in his family for 3 generations, was no longer his. The cattle that bore his brand, the horses he had trained from colts, the sturdy ranch house where his grandfather had been born, all of it now belonged to Tom Bradley, a man whose wealth had been built on the misfortune of others. The irony was not lost on Jake that he sat weeping in an alley while Bradley undoubtedly celebrated in the comfort of his mansion on the hill overlooking Cedar Falls. 6 months ago, Jake had been one of the most prosperous ranchers in 3 counties, his Silver Creek Ranch renowned for producing some of the finest cattle in Texas. His word had been his bond, his handshake worth more than most men's written contracts, and his reputation for fair dealing had earned him respect from ranchers and townspeople alike. But prosperity, Jake had learned the hard way, could disappear as quickly as morning mist when faced with the harsh sun of economic reality. The drought that had gripped the region for 8 months had decimated his grazing lands, forcing him to purchase feed at inflated prices just to keep his cattle alive. When disease struck his herd in late summer, wiping out nearly 40% of his stock, Jake had faced an impossible choice: watch his remaining cattle starve or seek financial assistance to tide him through until the rains returned and the grass grew green again. Tom Bradley had presented himself as Jake's salvation, offering a loan that seemed reasonable at the time. The terms appeared fair, the interest rate standard, and Bradley's assurances that he understood the temporary nature of Jake's difficulties had seemed genuine. What Jake had failed to recognize was the predatory nature that lurked beneath Bradley's friendly exterior, the carefully crafted legal language that would allow Bradley to call in the loan at the first sign of difficulty, and the corrupt network of judges and officials that would ensure any legal challenges would be decided in Bradley's favor. When the loan came due 3 weeks early, citing a clause buried deep in the fine print that Jake's struggling literacy had failed to catch, he had been forced to watch helplessly as everything his family had built was auctioned off to pay a debt that had mysteriously tripled in size due to hidden fees and compounding interest. The final blow had come that very afternoon when Bradley had offered to hire Jake as a common ranch hand on his own former property, suggesting with mock sympathy that at least Jake would be able to stay close to the land he loved. Emma stood in the rain for several long moments, watching this broken man and feeling her heart ache with recognition. She knew the particular sound of grief that came from losing everything that mattered, the way hope could drain from a person's soul like water from a cracked vessel. Her own tears had sounded much the same during those dark nights after Thomas's funeral, when she had held her growing belly and wondered how she would possibly manage to bring a child into a world that seemed so determined to crush the spirits of good people. The rain continued to fall, and Emma realized that her own discomfort was nothing compared to the misery of the man who sat exposed to the elements with nowhere else to go. Despite her own precarious circumstances, despite the practical voice in her head that warned her against getting involved with a stranger's troubles, Emma found herself stepping into the alley. "Sir," she called softly, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Sir, are you hurt?" Jake looked up sharply, his red-rimmed eyes wide with surprise and embarrassment. He had been so lost in his despair that he hadn't heard her approach. For a moment, he simply stared at this young woman whose gentle face showed genuine concern, despite the obvious signs of her own hardships. Her clothes were clean but worn, mended in places with careful stitches that spoke of necessity rather than choice. Her dark hair, damp from the rain, framed features that would have been beautiful if not for the shadows of worry that lingered around her eyes. "Ma'am," Jake managed to say, his voice rough from crying and thick with shame. He struggled to his feet, water streaming from his clothes as he attempted to compose himself. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. You shouldn't be out in this weather, not in your condition." Emma placed a protective hand over her belly, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the past several months. "Neither should you," she replied with a small smile that somehow managed to convey warmth despite the chill in the air. "There's a terrible storm coming, and you're soaked through. You'll catch your death sitting out here." Jake looked around the alley as if seeing it for the first time, suddenly aware of how pathetic he must appear to this kind stranger. "I suppose I don't have anywhere else to go at the moment," he admitted, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "Lost my place today. Lost everything, actually." There was something in the way he said it, a resigned honesty that told Emma this man was not seeking pity or trying to manipulate her sympathy. He was simply stating a fact, the way one might comment on the weather or the time of day. It was the voice of someone who had reached the bottom of a very deep well and was still trying to figure out which way was up. "I'm Emma Thompson," she said, extending her hand despite the rain that continued to fall around them. "And I believe there's always somewhere to go, even when it doesn't seem that way." Jake looked at her outstretched hand for a moment, then gently took it in his own work-roughened fingers. "Jake Mitchell," he replied. "And I appreciate your kindness, Mrs. Thompson, but I'm afraid I'm not very good company right now." "Emma," she corrected, noting the way he had carefully observed her wedding ring and drawn the appropriate conclusion about her marital status without making her explain her circumstances. "And I wasn't looking for company, Mr. Mitchell. I was thinking more about basic human decency. It's going to be a cold night, and there's a warm fire and hot coffee at my cottage. Nothing fancy, mind you, but it's dry and it's honest." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jake felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in weeks, a flicker of hope, or perhaps just gratitude for this unexpected kindness from a complete stranger. "I couldn't impose," he began, but Emma was already shaking her head. "It's not imposing if it's freely offered," she said firmly. "Besides, I could use the company. Gets awfully quiet in that little house, especially on nights like this." The truth was that Emma had been dreading the evening ahead, another long night of sitting alone with only her thoughts and her fears for company. The baby had been particularly active lately, as if sensing her anxiety, and the combination of physical discomfort and emotional isolation had made sleep elusive. The prospect of having another human being to talk to, even a stranger in distress, seemed like a gift rather than a burden. Jake studied her face, searching for any sign of uncertainty or fear that would suggest she was making this offer out of obligation rather than genuine desire to help. What he saw instead was a strength that belied her obvious vulnerability, a warmth that somehow managed to shine through despite her own apparent struggles. Here was a woman who was clearly facing her own challenges, the worn clothes, the careful way she moved to protect her unborn child, the shadows of worry in her eyes, yet she was willing to extend kindness to a complete stranger. "Are you certain?" he asked, giving her one final opportunity to reconsider what might be seen as a reckless decision. "You don't know anything about me, Mrs. Emma. For all you know, I could be dangerous." Emma looked at this man who had been weeping in the rain over his losses, who had struggled to his feet despite his obvious despair when she approached, who had immediately shown concern for her welfare despite his own dire circumstances. She thought of the gentle way he had taken her hand, the respect in his voice when he spoke to her, the shame rather than anger in his eyes when he admitted to his failures. "Mr. Mitchell," she said with a slight smile, "I've learned to trust my instincts about people. And my instincts tell me that a man who cries over his losses instead of raging about them, who worries about a stranger's welfare when he's at his lowest point, and who's more concerned about imposing than he is about taking advantage, well, that's not a dangerous man. That's a good man who's had some bad luck." The rain chose that moment to intensify, as if nature itself was encouraging Jake to accept this unexpected lifeline. He looked at Emma's face, saw the sincerity in her expression, and felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the possibility that perhaps he wasn't completely alone in the world after all. "In that case," he said, his voice still rough, but carrying a note of cautious hope, "I'd be honored to accept your hospitality, Emma, and I promise you won't regret the kindness." As they made their way through the muddy streets toward Emma's cottage, neither of them could have imagined how profoundly this chance encounter would change both of their lives. The rain continued to fall, washing away the dust and grime of the day, and perhaps, just perhaps, preparing the ground for something new to grow. Emma's cottage sat at the end of a winding dirt path that led away from the main thoroughfare of Cedar Falls, nestled beneath a grove of oak trees whose golden leaves rustled softly in the evening breeze. The modest structure, built of weathered pine boards and topped with a tin roof that sang gently under the rainfall, had been home to Emma and Thomas for the brief 2 years of their marriage. Now as she approached the front porch with Jake following a respectful distance behind, It seemed both sanctuary and prison, a place where memories lived alongside the harsh realities of an uncertain future. The porch creaked under their weight. As Emma fumbled for the key in her coat pocket, her fingers stiff from the cold rain, Jake stood quietly behind her, taking in the small details that spoke of a life carefully maintained, despite obvious financial constraints. The porch had been recently swept, the windows were clean despite their age, and a small herb garden beside the steps showed signs of loving attention even as the season turned toward winter. "Please come in," Emma said, pushing open the door, and stepping aside to allow Jake to enter first. The gesture spoke volumes about her character, even in her own home. She thought first of her guests' comfort and dignity. The interior of the cottage was spare but clean, furnished with pieces that had clearly been chosen for function rather than fashion. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, its hearth cold, but stacked with split logs ready for lighting. A small wooden table sat beneath the single window, surrounded by two simple chairs that had been crafted by hand rather than purchased from a furniture maker. The walls, though bare of expensive decorations, held a few carefully preserved photographs, and a sampler embroidered with the words, "Home is where love lives," in delicate blue thread. Jake removed his hat as he stepped inside, water dripping from the brim onto the worn wooden floor. The contrast between the warm, welcoming interior and the cold despair he had been experiencing in that alley struck him with unexpected force. Here was a home, modest though it might be, where care and attention had created something precious from very little. "Sit by the fire," Emma instructed, already moving toward the hearth with practiced efficiency. "I'll get it started, and then find you something dry to wear. Thomas was about your size, and I've been meaning to. Well, I suppose there's no sense in letting good clothes go to waste." The mention of her late husband hung in the air for a moment, neither of them quite sure how to navigate the delicate territory of recent loss. Jake watched as Emma knelt carefully beside the fireplace, her movements slow and deliberate as she arranged kindling and struck a match. The flames caught quickly, casting dancing shadows across her face and illuminating the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her, despite her obvious vulnerability. "I'm sorry for your loss," Jake said quietly, settling into the chair she had indicated. "Losing someone you love. Well, I imagine that's a pain that makes other troubles seem small by comparison." Emma paused in her work, staring into the growing flames as if they might hold answers to questions she wasn't ready to ask. "Thank you," she replied softly. "Thomas was a good man. Worked hard, treated people fairly, never asked for more than his share. Sometimes I wonder why good people seem to bear more than their portion of suffering, while others who care for nothing but themselves prosper." The bitterness in her voice was subtle but unmistakable, and Jake recognized the particular edge that came from watching justice fail to materialize when it was needed most. He thought of Tom Bradley, probably sitting in his warm mansion at that very moment, celebrating his latest acquisition while the man he had cheated sat warming himself by a stranger's fire. "I've been wondering the same thing myself lately," Jake admitted, accepting the blanket Emma brought him from a chest in the corner of the room. "Seems like doing right by people ought to count for something in this world, but maybe that's just foolish thinking." Emma disappeared into what he assumed was the bedroom, returning moments later with an armful of men's clothing. The shirt and trousers she handed him were well made, but showing signs of careful mending, patches sewn with tiny, precise stitches that spoke of both necessity and pride. There was something deeply personal about accepting clothes that had belonged to another man, particularly from his widow, and Jake felt the weight of trust implicit in the gesture. "The bedroom is just through there," Emma said, nodding toward the doorway behind him. "Take your time getting changed. I'll put some coffee on the stove and see what I can manage for supper." Jake changed quickly, grateful to be out of his soaked clothes but acutely aware of the intimacy of wearing garments that had belonged to Emma's deceased husband. The shirt fit reasonably well across the shoulders, though it was perhaps an inch too short in the sleeves. The trousers were likewise acceptable, held up by suspenders that had been adjusted for a slightly smaller man. As he folded his wet clothes carefully and prepared to return to the main room, Jake caught sight of himself in the small mirror that hung above a washstand in the corner. The man looking back at him seemed like a stranger, hollow-eyed, unshaven, wearing dead man's clothes and depending on the charity of a pregnant widow for basic shelter. 6 months ago, he had been Jake Mitchell of Silver Creek Ranch, a man whose word carried weight in business dealings and whose opinion was sought on matters of cattle and land management. Now he was simply another casualty of circumstances beyond his control, reduced to accepting handouts from someone who could barely afford to give them. When he returned to the main room, the smell of coffee filled the air, rich and dark and infinitely comforting. Emma moved around the small kitchen area with careful efficiency, her movements revealing the careful economy of someone who had learned to make much from little. She had changed into a dry dress of dark blue wool that emphasized her condition while maintaining an air of quiet dignity. "The coffee will be ready in a moment," she said, glancing over at him with approval. "Those clothes suit you better than they ever did Thomas." He was a good man, but he never quite filled them out the way they were meant to be filled. Jake settled back into his chair by the fire, feeling warmth seep back into his bones for the first time in hours. "You're very kind to say so. And very generous to share them. I promise I'll find a way to repay your kindness once I get back on my feet." Emma poured coffee into 2 mismatched cups, handing one to Jake before settling carefully into the chair across from him. The baby must have shifted position, because she winced slightly and placed a hand on her side, rubbing gently at what was obviously a tender spot. "When is your baby due?" Jake asked, noting her discomfort and the way she seemed to be constantly adjusting her position to accommodate the growing life within her. "Early December, according to Dr. Collins," Emma replied, taking a careful sip of the hot coffee. "First babies often come late," she says, "so it could be closer to Christmas." Thomas was so excited about becoming a father. He had already started building a cradle, working on it every evening after supper. "It's still in the bedroom, half finished. I haven't had the heart to do anything with it." The pain in her voice was raw and immediate, and Jake felt his own. Troubles fade temporarily into the background as he contemplated the enormity of what this woman was facing. To lose a husband was devastating enough, but to face the prospect of raising a child alone, with limited resources and no family support system, seemed almost unbearably difficult. "Do you have family nearby?" he asked gently. "Parents or siblings? Who might be able to help when the time comes?" Emma shook her head, staring into the depths of her coffee cup as if it might contain answers to her dilemmas. "My parents died when I was 16, and I was an only child. Thomas had a brother in California, but they hadn't spoken in years over some foolish disagreement I never fully understood. Men and their pride," she added with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The irony of her comment was not lost on Jake, who recognized that his own pride had played no small part in his current predicament. If he had been willing to swallow his dignity and accept work as a common laborer, instead of trying to maintain his status as a rancher, he might have been able to avoid borrowing money from Tom Bradley in the first place. Pride, it seemed, was a luxury that good people could rarely afford. "What will you do?" Jake asked, though he suspected the question was one that had been haunting Emma for months. "About the baby, I mean. About supporting yourself." Emma's hand moved instinctively to her belly, a protective gesture that spoke of maternal love already fierce and strong despite the challenges ahead. "I've been taking in sewing and mending for some of the ladies in town," she said. "Mrs. Henderson at the general store has been kind enough to recommend me to her customers. It doesn't pay much, but it's honest work, and I can do it from home even after the baby comes." Jake nodded, understanding the pride that made her emphasize the honesty. of her work. In a world where desperate people sometimes turn to less respectable means of survival, Emma was determined to maintain her dignity even at the cost of comfort and security. "That's admirable," he said sincerely. "A lot of people in difficult circumstances might be tempted to take easier paths, even if they weren't entirely honorable. Thomas always said that how you make your money matters as much as how much you make," Emma replied. He could have made more working for some of the less scrupulous businessmen in town, but he preferred to earn less and sleep well at night. "I suppose I inherited that philosophy along with his debts." The mention of debts caught Jake's attention, though he was careful not to pry too obviously into Emma's financial situation. "The sewing work pays enough to cover your expenses?" he asked, hoping his tone conveyed general concern rather than specific curiosity. Emma's hesitation told him more than any direct answer might have. "For now," she said carefully, "though I may need to find something that pays better once the baby comes. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that her sister in Austin is looking for a housekeeper, someone reliable who could manage a large household. The pay would be substantially better than what I make with needlework." "Austin is a long way from Cedar Falls," Jake observed, noting the sadness that flickered across Emma's features at the mention of leaving. "Nearly 100 miles, Emma agreed. "It would mean starting over completely, leaving behind everything familiar. But sometimes starting over is the only choice available when staying put means watching everything fall apart slowly." Jake understood that sentiment better than she knew. His own plans had been trending in a similar direction before this unexpected evening of hospitality had reminded him that kindness still existed in the world. The idea of leaving Texas entirely had been growing in his mind throughout the long, miserable day, perhaps heading north to Kansas or Colorado, where a man with his experience might find work on someone else's ranch and slowly rebuild his life from nothing. "Have you given much thought to what you'll do next?" Emma asked, as if reading his thoughts. "I know it's not my place to ask, but you seem like a man who's used to having plans and purposes. Losing that sense of direction can be almost as devastating as losing everything else." Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames dance in the fireplace and considering how much of his story he was willing to share with this kind stranger. There was something about Emma's gentle manner and obvious struggles that made him want to be honest, to lay down the burden of pretending that his situation was anything other than desperate. "I was a rancher," he said finally. "Had a spread north of town, 2,000 acres of good grazing land that had been in my family for 3 generations. Lost it all to a man who makes his living by taking advantage of other people's hard luck." Emma's eyes widened slightly at this revelation. Silver Creek Ranch was well known in the area, and she had heard Thomas speak respectfully of Jake Mitchell on several occasions. The idea that such a successful and respected man could fall so far so quickly was both shocking and terrifying, a reminder of how fragile prosperity could be for even the most careful and hardworking people. "Tom Bradley," she said, the name carrying a weight of understanding and shared distaste. "You know him?" Jake asked, surprised by the certainty in her voice. "Know of him," Emma corrected. "He holds the note on this cottage now, bought it from the bank after Thomas died, and I fell behind on payments. I have until the end of November to bring the account current, or I'll be looking for new accommodations. He made a point of visiting personally to inform me of the situation, very polite and sympathetic on the surface, but there was something in his eyes that made me uncomfortable." Jake felt anger rising in his chest, a hot fury that temporarily burned away the despair that had been consuming him. The idea of Tom Bradley intimidating a pregnant widow, using her vulnerability to increase his already substantial holdings, represented everything that was wrong with men who confused wealth with worth. "That sounds like Bradley," Jake said grimly. "He has a talent for making his cruelty seem like kindness, for presenting his greed as business necessity. I'm sorry you've had to deal with him." "How much do you owe him?" Emma asked quietly. Nothing anymore, Jake replied with bitter irony. He foreclosed on everything, took the ranch, the cattle, even my personal horses. Legally, I suppose. My debt to him is satisfied. He offered me a job, though working as a ranch hand on my own former property. Said he'd pay fair wages and let me stay in the bunkhouse with the other hired help. Emma could hear the pain and humiliation beneath Jake's carefully controlled words. For a man who had built his life around independence and self-respect, such an offer would be worse than charity. It would be a daily reminder of everything he had lost. A constant humiliation designed to break his spirit completely. You turned him down, she said. It wasn't a question. I did, Jake confirmed. Maybe that makes me a fool, choosing pride over practical necessity. But I couldn't bear the thought of watching other men work land that should have been my legacy, taking orders from foremen on property where my grandfather was born. Emma leaned forward slightly, her expression serious and intent. That doesn't make you a fool, she said firmly. That makes you a man with principles. There are worse things than being poor, Mr. Mitchell. Being rich at the cost of your self-respect is one of them. Her words hit Jake with unexpected force, reminding him of truths he had been in danger of forgetting during his darkest moments. Here was a woman facing her own desperate circumstances, yet she understood instinctively that some prices were too high to pay, some compromises too devastating to make. Thank you for saying that, he said quietly. I've been wondering if I made the right choice, if maybe I should have swallowed my pride and taken what Bradley offered. At least then I'd have steady work and a place to sleep. And every day you'd wake up a little less yourself, Emma replied. I watched it happen to my father near the end. He took a job with a man who treated him poorly because we needed the money, and it ate away at him piece by piece until there was hardly anything left of the man I remembered. The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence as both of them contemplated the difficult choices that circumstances had forced upon them. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and the wind rattled the windows with increasing intensity. The storm that had been threatening all day was finally arriving in earnest, bringing with it the promise of a long, cold night. Emma rose carefully from her chair, moving to the window to peer out at the darkening sky. It's going to be a terrible night, she observed. The temperature's dropping, and that wind sounds like it means business. I have a spare quilt, and the sofa pulls out into a bed of sorts. It's not luxurious, but it's warm and dry. Jake started to protest, to insist that he had already imposed too much on her kindness, but Emma held up a hand to forestall his objections. Mr. Mitchell, she said with a small smile, I may be young and I may be pregnant and I may be poor, but I'm not stupid. No decent person sends another human being out into a storm like this, especially not when there's room and warmth to spare. Besides, she added, her tone becoming more serious, I have to admit that having another person in the house makes me feel safer. It gets lonely here at night, and with the baby coming soon, I worry about what would happen if something went wrong and there was no one to help. The honesty of her admission touched Jake deeply. Here was a woman who had already given him more than he had any right to expect, yet she was finding ways to make her continued hospitality seem like a favor to her rather than charity to him. It was a graceful gesture that preserved his dignity, while acknowledging the reality of their mutual need for companionship in difficult times. In that case, Jake said, I'd be honored to accept your offer, and I promise that whatever tomorrow brings, you won't regret the kindness you've shown me today. As Emma prepared the makeshift bed and Jake banked the fire for the night, neither of them realized that they had already begun the process of saving each other. The partnership that was forming between them was born not of romance or calculation, but of simple human decency and mutual recognition of shared struggle. In a world that seemed determined to crush the spirits of good people, they had found in each other a reminder that compassion and honor still mattered, that there were still those willing to choose kindness over self-preservation. The storm raged outside their small sanctuary, but within the cottage's modest walls, two lost souls had begun the slow process of finding their way back to hope. Dawn broke gray and cold over Cedar Falls, the storm having passed but leaving behind a world transformed by its fury. Jake woke to the sound of Emma moving quietly around the kitchen, the soft clink of dishes and the gentle whisper of her footsteps, creating a domestic symphony that he hadn't heard in months. For a moment, lying on the surprisingly comfortable makeshift bed, he allowed himself to forget the harsh realities that awaited beyond the cottage walls. The smell of bacon frying and coffee brewing filled the small space, reminding Jake how long it had been since he had awakened to the promise of a proper breakfast. During the week since losing his ranch, he had subsisted on whatever he could afford from the general store: hard bread, dried meat, and beans that he cooked over small fires when he could find shelter from the wind. The luxury of fresh coffee and hot food prepared by caring hands seemed almost dreamlike after so many mornings of cold desperation. "Good morning," Emma said softly when she noticed he had awakened. Her face looked rested despite everything, and there was a quiet contentment in her manner that suggested she too had found comfort in not spending the night alone. "I hope you slept well." The wind finally died down around midnight. Jake sat up carefully, running his hands through his hair and trying to restore some semblance of dignity to his appearance. "Better than I have in weeks," he admitted honestly. "Thank you again for your kindness. I can't remember the last time I woke up feeling genuinely rested." Emma smiled as she set a plate before him, loaded with eggs, bacon, and thick slices of bread that had been toasted golden brown over the fire. "Eat up," she instructed with gentle authority. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in far too long, and you'll need your strength for whatever today brings." Jake took a bite of the eggs and closed his eyes briefly, savoring not just the taste but the simple human kindness represented by this carefully prepared meal. "This is wonderful," he said, and meant it completely. "You didn't have to go to such trouble." "It wasn't any trouble," Emma replied, settling across from him with her own smaller portion. "Besides, I've been eating alone for months now. It's nice to cook for someone who appreciates it." As they ate, Jake found himself studying Emma's face in the morning light, noting details he had missed the previous evening. There were faint lines around her eyes that spoke of recent stress and sleepless nights, but there was also a fundamental strength in her features that suggested she had faced adversity before and survived it. Her hands, he noticed, bore the small scars and calluses that came from genuine work sewing, cleaning, and managing a household with limited resources but unlimited determination. "I've been thinking," Emma said carefully, setting down her fork and meeting his eyes directly, "about what you said last night regarding your situation with Tom Bradley and the ranch." Jake tensed slightly, unsure where this conversation might lead, but sensing that Emma had been considering something significant during the quiet hours of the early morning. "I know it's not my place to offer advice," she continued, "but it seems to me that a man with your experience and reputation shouldn't have to leave Texas entirely just because one crooked businessman has made life difficult here." "Emma," Jake began, but she raised a gentle hand to forestall his response. "Please, let me finish," she said. "I know you feel like Bradley has taken everything from you, and in many ways he has. But he can't take your knowledge, your skills, or your reputation among honest people. There are other ranchers in this county who know your worth, who would be glad to have your expertise, even if they can't offer you land ownership right away." Jake considered her words, recognizing the logic in them, even as his pride resisted. The idea of working for others on terms far less favorable than those he had once enjoyed. "It's not just about the work," he said slowly. "It's about starting over from nothing when I'm 32 years old, having to prove myself all over again to men who used to seek my advice." Emma leaned forward slightly, her expression earnest and compelling. But you wouldn't be starting from nothing, she insisted. You'd be starting with decades of experience, with knowledge that comes only from actually working the land and understanding cattle. That's worth more than money in many ways, because money can be lost, but knowledge stays with you forever. Her words struck Jake with unexpected force, reminding him of conversations he had once had with his grandfather about the true sources of a man's worth. The old man had always insisted that land and cattle were just tools, that the real value lay in understanding how to use those tools effectively. Perhaps Emma was right. Perhaps Bradley had taken his property, but not his ability to rebuild. There's something else, Emma continued, her voice becoming more tentative. I heard at the general store yesterday that the widow Morrison is looking for someone to help manage her late husband's spread. She's got good land and healthy stock, but she's getting on in years and her sons have all moved to the city. She needs someone she can trust, someone with integrity who won't try to take advantage of her situation. Jake's interest was immediately piqued. He remembered the Morrison Ranch well, a modest but well-managed operation about 10 miles south of Cedar Falls. Old Carl Morrison had been a careful, methodical rancher who had built his herd slowly and treated his land with respect. If his widow was indeed looking for help, it might represent exactly the kind of opportunity Jake needed. Do you think she would consider someone in my position? He asked, trying to keep the hope out of his voice. I mean, given what happened with Bradley, some people might see me as a poor risk. Emma shook her head firmly. Mrs. Morrison is a smart woman who's lived long enough to know the difference between bad luck and bad character. Besides, half the county knows that what Bradley did to you wasn't right, even if they don't feel comfortable speaking out against him publicly. The possibility of legitimate work, of using his skills in service of a cause larger than his own, survival, began to kindle something in Jake's chest that he had thought was permanently extinguished. For weeks, he had been focused solely on the magnitude of his losses, on the unfairness of his situation, and the bleakness of his prospects. Emma's perspective offered a different way of looking at his circumstances, not as an ending, but as a chance to prove what he was truly made of. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to speak with her, Jake said carefully. Though I have to be honest, I'm not sure I'm ready to trust my judgment about people anymore. I thought I knew Tom Bradley well enough to do business with him safely. Emma's expression grew thoughtful as she considered this admission. You know, she said slowly, sometimes when we've been hurt badly, we lose confidence in our ability to judge people fairly. But the fact that Bradley fooled you doesn't mean your instincts about people are wrong. It just means he's very good at deception. How can I tell the difference? Jake asked, and there was genuine uncertainty in his voice. How do I know when I'm being cautious and when I'm just being afraid? Emma was quiet for a moment, her hand moving absently to rest on her belly. As she considered his question, I think, she said finally, that the difference lies in whether your caution is based on wisdom or on fear. Wisdom tells you to look carefully at a person's actions over time, to listen to what others say about their character, to pay attention to how they treat people who can't benefit them. Fear just tells you to avoid taking any risks at all. Her words resonated with Jake in a way that surprised him. Here was a young woman who had every reason to be afraid, pregnant, widowed, financially struggling, yet she had taken a significant risk the night before by inviting a strange man into her home. She had acted on wisdom rather than fear, trusting her instincts about his character despite having no guarantee that her judgment was sound. You took quite a risk yourself last night, he pointed out. Bringing me here, trusting me with your safety. How did you know you could trust me? Emma smiled, and for the first time since he had met her, it was a smile completely free of sadness or worry. Because desperate men who weep over their losses instead of raging about them, who worry about imposing on others when they have nothing left to lose, who show respect for pregnant widows instead of seeing them as opportunities to exploit those, aren't dangerous men. Those are good men who've had bad things happen to them. Jake felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of shame and self-doubt that had been choking him for weeks. Emma's faith in his character, based on nothing more than her observations of his behavior in crisis, reminded him that integrity was not something that could be taken away by external circumstances. Bradley might have stolen his land and his cattle, but he could not steal the fundamental decency that defined Jake's character. "You're remarkable," he said quietly, and meant it completely. "I don't know many people who could face what you're facing and still find the energy to encourage someone else." Emma's cheeks colored slightly at the compliment, but her expression remained serious. "We all need encouragement sometimes," she said simply. "And I've found that helping others often helps me more than it helps them. When I focus on what I can do for someone else, I worry less about what I can't do for myself." A sharp knock at the door interrupted their conversation, causing both of them to freeze momentarily. In a small town like Cedar Falls, unexpected visitors were unusual, enough to be noteworthy, and the authoritative quality of the knock suggested official business rather than a friendly social call. Emma rose carefully and moved to the window, peering out through the curtains before her face went pale. "It's Sheriff Roberts," she said quietly, glancing back at Jake with obvious concern. "And he's not alone." Jake felt his stomach drop as he recognized the implications of a sheriff's visit so early in the morning. Had someone seen him enter Emma's cottage the night before and drawn inappropriate conclusions about their relationship? Had Tom Bradley discovered his whereabouts and decided to cause additional trouble for him? The possibilities raced through his mind, each one worse than the last. "Maybe I should go out the back," Jake suggested, already rising from his chair. "I don't want to cause you any trouble with the law." "No," Emma said firmly, turning away from the window to face him directly. "You've done nothing wrong, and neither have I. Whatever Sheriff Roberts wants, we'll face it together and with clear consciences." The knock came again, more insistent this time, and Emma moved to the door with determined steps. Jake remained standing beside the table, trying to project confidence he didn't feel while mentally preparing for whatever accusations might be about to fall upon them. "Sheriff Roberts," Emma said politely as she opened the door. "Good morning. How can I help you?" Sheriff Bill Roberts was a tall, lean man in his 50s whose weathered face had been carved by decades of dealing with the worst aspects of human nature. He had done the law in Cedar Falls for nearly 20 years, long enough to develop a reputation for fairness balanced with an unwillingness to tolerate nonsense from anyone, regardless of their social standing or financial resources. "Morning, Mrs. Thompson," Roberts said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "I apologize for the early hour, but I need to speak with Mr. Mitchell here. Word around town is that he might be staying with you." Jake stepped forward, squaring his shoulders and meeting the sheriff's gaze directly. "I'm Jake Mitchell," he said calmly. "Is there something I can help you with, Sheriff?" Robert studied Jake's face for a moment, his expression unreadable. "There's been some trouble out at the Morrison place," he said. "Cattle rustling, looks like. Mrs. Morrison lost about 30 head sometime in the past 2 days, and there are tracks leading north toward where your old spread used to be." Jake felt the blood drain from his face as the implications of the sheriff's words sank in. Cattle rustling was a serious crime in Texas, one that carried severe penalties including potential imprisonment. The fact that the tracks led toward his former property would make him an obvious suspect, especially given his recent financial difficulties and public humiliation at Bradley's hands. "Sheriff," Jake began, but Roberts held up a hand to forestall his response. "Now, before you get all worked up," the sheriff continued, "I want you to know that I'm not here to arrest you. Mrs. Morrison specifically asked me to find you because she wants to talk to you about the situation. She seems to think you might be able to help identify who might be responsible." The relief that flooded through Jake was so intense it made him momentarily dizzy. For a moment, he had seen his entire future crumbling yet again, had imagined himself facing criminal charges. That would destroy any chance of rebuilding his life. The fact that Mrs. Morrison wanted his help rather than his arrest suggested that his reputation for honesty remained intact despite recent events. "Of course," Jake said immediately. "I'd be happy to help in any way I can. When would she like to meet?" "Soon as possible," Roberts replied. "She's pretty shaken up by this business, and she's worried they might come back for more. I told her I'd bring you out this morning if you were willing." Emma stepped forward, her expression concerned, but resolute. "Sheriff, Mr. Mitchell was here all night during the storm. If the rustling happened recently, he couldn't have been involved." Roberts nodded, his expression remaining carefully neutral. "I appreciate that information, ma'am. Though I should mention that the tracks are at least 2 days old, maybe 3. The rain last night washed out a lot of the sign, which is part of why Mrs. Morrison wants Mr. Mitchell's opinion about what might have happened." Jake felt Emma's eyes on him and realized that she was offering him an alibi for the previous night without any prompting from him. The gesture spoke volumes about her character and her willingness to stand by someone she had chosen to trust. It also reminded him that his whereabouts for the past several days before arriving in Cedar Falls were largely unaccounted for. He had been drifting aimlessly through the countryside, sleeping rough and avoiding contact with anyone who might recognize him. "I understand Mrs. Morrison's concern," Jake said. "Losing cattle is serious business, especially for someone managing a ranch alone. I'll be glad to look at the scene and offer whatever insights I can." Sheriff Roberts nodded, apparently satisfied with Jake's cooperative attitude. "Good. We'll head out there directly, if that suits you. Mrs. Morrison is expecting us before noon." As Jake prepared to leave with the sheriff, Emma touched his arm gently. "Be careful," she said quietly. "And remember what we talked about trusting your judgment and not letting fear make your decisions for you." Jake covered her hand with his own, drawing strength from her quiet confidence in his character. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything. I'll be back this evening if that's acceptable to you." "It is," Emma replied without hesitation. "I'll keep supper warm." As Jake rode out of Cedar Falls beside Sheriff Roberts, heading toward the Morrison Ranch and whatever challenges awaited there, he carried with him something he hadn't possessed since the day he lost his land: a sense of purpose and the knowledge that someone believed in his worth as a man. Emma's faith in his character had reminded him that reputation was not something that could be stolen or sold. It was something that had to be earned through consistent behavior over time, and something that would ultimately speak louder than any temporary reversal of fortune. The Morrison Ranch came into view just before midday, a modest but well-maintained operation that spoke of careful stewardship and practical management. Mrs. Morrison herself was waiting on the front porch, a small, gray-haired woman whose sharp eyes and firm posture suggested that advancing age had not diminished her mental acuity or determination. She watched their approach with obvious anxiety, her weathered hands clasped tightly in front of her as if holding herself together through sheer force of will. "Mrs. Morrison," Sheriff Roberts called out as they dismounted, "I've brought Jake Mitchell, as requested. He's agreed to take a look at the situation and see if he can offer any insights." The elderly woman studied Jake's face intently, her gaze searching and evaluating. "Mr. Mitchell," she said finally, "I appreciate you coming out here, especially given your own recent troubles. I know Tom Bradley has been spreading stories around town about your business dealings, but I've known you for years, and I know the kind of man you are." Jake felt a rush of gratitude toward this straightforward woman who was willing to judge him based on her own experience rather than on gossip and speculation. "Thank you, ma'am," he said sincerely. "I'm sorry to hear about your losses. Cattle rustling is a serious matter, and I'll do whatever I can to help." Mrs. Morrison nodded briskly and led them toward the pasture where the theft had occurred. As they walked, She explained the circumstances of the crime with the precision of someone who had spent her entire life managing livestock and understanding the patterns of ranch life. It happened sometime between Sunday night and Tuesday morning, she said. 30 head of prime cattle, all from the same section of pasture near the north fence line. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. They took the best animals and left the rest undisturbed. Professional work, not some desperate cowboys looking for easy money. Jake examined the remaining tracks carefully, noting the organization and efficiency that had characterized the theft. The rustlers had worked methodically, cutting out specific animals and moving them in a coordinated pattern that suggested both experience and advanced planning. This was not the work of opportunistic thieves, but of a sophisticated operation with resources and connections. The tracks head north, Sheriff Roberts observed, toward where Silver Creek Ranch used to be. Could be coincidence, or could be someone trying to point suspicion in a particular direction. Jake knelt beside the clearest set of tracks, studying the pattern of hoofprints and wheel marks with the practiced eye of someone who had spent his entire adult life reading sign. What he saw there made his blood run cold, not because it implicated him, but because it revealed something far more sinister than simple cattle theft. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "I think you need to see this." Sheriff Roberts and Mrs. Morrison crouched beside Jake, their faces grave as he pointed out the details that had caught his attention in the maze of tracks left behind by the cattle thieves. The evidence painted a picture far more complex and disturbing than a simple rustling operation, one that spoke of careful planning and intimate knowledge of local ranching operations. "See here," Jake said, indicating a particular set of horseshoe prints that had been partially obscured by the stolen cattle's hoofprints. "This horse has a distinctive shoe pattern. There's a small notch in the left front shoe, probably from a stone that got wedged in and left a permanent mark. I've seen this exact pattern before, many times." "Where?" Sheriff Roberts asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Tom Bradley's stallion," Jake replied grimly. "Big black horse he's particularly proud of. He had those shoes specially made by the blacksmith in Austin. Claims they give the animal better traction on rocky ground. That notch has been there for months." Mrs. Morrison's weathered face hardened as she absorbed the implications of Jake's discovery. "Are you saying Tom Bradley was involved in stealing my cattle?" "I'm saying his horse was here when this happened," Jake corrected carefully. "Whether he was riding it or someone else was is something we'll need to determine. But this particular shoe pattern is as distinctive as a signature." Sheriff Roberts stood slowly, dusting off his knees as he considered the ramifications of this evidence. Tom Bradley was one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the county, with connections that reached into the State House and beyond. Accusing him of cattle rustling would require absolute proof and careful handling, or it could backfire spectacularly on everyone involved. "This complicates things considerably," Roberts said finally. "Bradley's got enough political influence to make life very difficult for anyone who accuses him without ironclad evidence. We'll need more than horseshoe prints to build a case that will stick." Jake nodded, understanding the sheriff's caution while feeling frustration at the careful calculations required to pursue justice against wealthy criminals. "There might be more evidence," he suggested. "If this was Bradley's operation, he'll need somewhere to hold the cattle until he can move them out of the county. 30 head require significant space and resources. Any ideas where he might take them?" Mrs. Morrison asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. Jake thought carefully about Bradley's various properties and business interests, trying to identify locations that would be suitable for temporarily housing stolen livestock. "He's got that old line shack about 15 miles north of his main house," he said slowly. "It's in a remote canyon with good grass and water, easy to defend if anyone comes looking. He used to use it during roundups, but it's been abandoned for the past couple of years." Sheriff Roberts considered this information while studying the tracks that led north from the Morrison Ranch. It's worth investigating, he decided. But we'll need to be careful about how we approach this. If Bradley is involved, he'll have people watching for any signs of official interest in his activities. I could ride out there and take a look around, Jake offered. As far as anyone knows, I'm just a down-on-his-luck former rancher who might be scouting the area for work. Nobody would think twice about seeing me in that part of the county. Mrs. Morrison shook her head firmly. Absolutely not. If Bradley is behind this, and he suspects you're investigating, he might see you as a threat to be eliminated. Besides, you've already done enough by identifying that horseshoe pattern. This is a job for the law now. Jake appreciated her concern, but he also understood that official law enforcement would face limitations that he did not. With respect, ma'am, Sheriff Roberts can't just ride up to that line shack without probable cause that would stand up in court. But I can take a casual ride through the area and see if there's anything worth reporting officially. It's too dangerous, Mrs. Morrison insisted. Bradley has already destroyed your life once. Why give him another opportunity? The question hung in the air between them, and Jake realized that his answer would reveal something fundamental about who he had chosen to become in the aftermath of his losses. He could play it safe, avoid any risks that might bring him into further conflict with Tom Bradley, and focus solely on rebuilding his own life from the ashes of his former prosperity. Or he could choose to stand up for what was right, even if it meant facing additional dangers and uncertainties. Because running away from bullies never makes them stop, Jake said finally. It just encouraged them to find new victims. If Bradley is stealing cattle from honest ranchers, he needs to be stopped before he ruins more lives. Sheriff Roberts studied Jake's face for a long moment, clearly weighing the potential benefits of unofficial reconnaissance against the risks of involving a civilian in what could become a dangerous investigation. If you do decide to ride out there, he said carefully, you go in daylight, you stay visible, and you don't do anything that could be construed as trespassing or interference with private property. You're just a man looking for work who happened to be riding through the area. Jake nodded his understanding of these parameters, while privately acknowledging that the situation might require more flexibility than the sheriff's careful instructions would allow. I understand, he said, and I'll report back to you before taking any further action. The ride back to Cedar Falls gave Jake time to consider the implications of what they had discovered and the choices that lay ahead of him. For weeks, he had been focused primarily on his own survival and recovery, trying to come to terms with his losses and figure out how to rebuild his life. Now suddenly, he found himself positioned to potentially help other victims of Bradley's schemes while simultaneously working to expose the corrupt practices that had destroyed his own livelihood. There was danger in this path, certainly. Bradley had already demonstrated his willingness to use legal manipulation and economic pressure to destroy his enemies. If he was indeed involved in cattle rustling, he might be prepared to use more direct and violent methods to protect his interests. But there was also opportunity, the chance to turn his intimate knowledge of Bradley's character and methods into a weapon for justice rather than simply accepting the role of helpless victim. By the time Jake reached Emma's cottage, the afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows across the town, and the promise of another cold evening hung in the crisp air. He found Emma in her small garden, carefully harvesting the last of the season's vegetables before the inevitable frost could claim them. She looked up as he approached, her face lighting with relief at his safe return. "How did it go?" she asked immediately, noting the tension in his posture and the thoughtful expression that suggested complicated developments. Jake helped her to her feet, noting how carefully she moved as her pregnancy progressed into its final months. "It went well," he said, "and it went badly, depending on how you look at it. Mrs. Morrison wants to hire me to help manage her ranch, which is wonderful news. But we also discovered evidence that Tom Bradley might be involved in stealing her cattle. Emma's eyes widened as she absorbed this information. That's very serious," she said slowly. "What kind of evidence?" As they walked back toward the cottage, Jake explained about the distinctive horseshoe pattern and the implications of finding Bradley's horse's tracks at the scene of the theft. Emma listened intently, asking occasional questions that demonstrated her understanding of both the legal complexities and the personal dangers involved. "So what happens now?" she asked as they settled into their chairs by the fireplace. "Sheriff Roberts wants to investigate officially, but he needs more evidence before he can move against someone with Bradley's connections," Jake explained. "I offered to do some unofficial scouting, see if I can locate where the stolen cattle might be hidden." Emma was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded over her belly as she stared into the dancing flames. "You're going to do it," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "I think I have to," Jake replied honestly. "Not just because of what he did to me, but because of what he's doing to other people. Mrs. Morrison is a good woman who's worked hard her entire life. She doesn't deserve to have her cattle stolen by someone who already has more wealth than he could spend in a lifetime. And if he discovers what you're doing?" Emma asked quietly. "If he decides you're too much of a threat to his operations?" Jake had been avoiding that particular question, but Emma's direct approach forced him to confront the reality of the risks he was considering. "Then I suppose I'll deal with whatever consequences arise," he said. "But I can't just walk away from this, Emma. I won't be able to live with myself if I let fear keep me from doing what's right." Emma leaned forward in her chair, her expression serious and intent. "I'm not trying to talk you out of it," she said carefully. "I'm just trying to make sure you understand what you're risking. You've already lost everything once because of Tom Bradley. Are you prepared to lose even more?" The question struck Jake with unexpected force, because it made him realize how much his perspective had changed since the previous evening. 24 hours ago, he had felt like he had nothing left to lose, that his life had been reduced to mere survival with no larger purpose or meaning. But Emma's kindness and Mrs. Morrison's faith in his character had reminded him that he still possessed things of value: his reputation for integrity, his skills and knowledge, and perhaps most importantly, his capacity to help others who were facing the same predatory behavior that had destroyed his own livelihood. "I think," Jake said slowly, "that I've already lost the most important things Bradley could take from me. My land, my cattle, my financial security, those are all gone. But what I'm discovering is that there are some things he can't take, things that can only be surrendered voluntarily." "Such as?" Emma prompted gently. "My sense of who I am as a man," Jake replied. "My commitment to doing right by people, even when it's difficult or dangerous. My willingness to stand up for others who can't defend themselves. If I let fear of what Bradley might do keep me from helping Mrs. Morrison and other potential victims, then I'll have given him something far more valuable than my ranch." Emma smiled, and there was warmth and pride in her expression that made Jake's heart skip unexpectedly. "That's exactly what I hoped you would say," she said softly. "Not because I want you to be in danger, but because I've seen the kind of man you are, and I would hate for you to let circumstances change that." The conversation fell into comfortable silence as both of them contemplated the challenges that lay ahead. Outside, the wind was picking up again, rattling the windows, and reminding them that winter was approaching rapidly. The cottage felt warm and secure around them, a sanctuary where honesty and kindness created a refuge from the harsh realities of the world beyond its walls. "Emma," Jake said eventually, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that your answer won't change my decision about helping Mrs. Morrison." Emma looked at him expectantly, sensing that whatever he was about to say would be significant. "If something were to happen to me," Jake continued carefully, "if Bradley or his people decided I was too much of a threat and took action to eliminate that threat, what would happen to you?" You've been kind enough to shelter me and feed me. But I realize that my presence here might have put you in danger as well." Emma considered his question seriously, recognizing the genuine concern behind it, while also understanding what he was really asking. "Are you worried about my safety?" she asked. "Or are you looking for a reason to avoid taking risks?" Jake met her gaze directly. "Both probably," he admitted. "I care about what happens to you, Emma, more than I expected to care about anyone after losing so much. But I also know that sometimes we use concern for others as an excuse to avoid doing difficult things." "I appreciate your honesty," Emma said, "and I care about what happens to you too. But Jake, I can't make your moral decisions for you. What I can tell you is that I'm not helpless, despite appearances. I've been taking care of myself for months now, and I'll continue to do so regardless of what you decide about Tom Bradley." Jake felt something shift in his chest as he looked at this remarkable woman who had somehow managed to maintain her strength and independence, despite facing challenges that would have crushed many people. Her refusal to accept the role of helpless victim, either for herself or as an excuse for his own choices, reminded him of why he had been drawn to her in the first place. "There's something else," Emma continued, her voice becoming softer and more personal. "Something I've been thinking about since last night." Jake waited, sensing that whatever she was about to say would be important. "When Thomas died," Emma said slowly, "I thought my life was essentially over. Not in the sense that I wanted to die, but in the sense that I believed all the good things were behind me. I was going to be a poor widow raising a child alone, struggling just to survive from day to day. I never imagined that I might meet someone who could remind me that there are still good men in the world, men who choose to do right even when it costs them dearly." Jake felt his throat tighten as he understood the significance of what she was telling him. "Emma, I'm not asking you for promises or declarations," she continued gently. "I know we've only known each other for a day, and I know you're dealing with your own struggles. But I want you to understand that you've already given me something precious: hope. Hope that decent people still exist. Hope that kindness and integrity still matter. Hope that maybe the future doesn't have to be as bleak as I had imagined." Jake reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand in his, marveling at the delicate strength of her fingers and the warmth that seemed to radiate from her touch. "You've given me the same thing," he said quietly. "Yesterday morning, I thought I was finished. Not just financially, but as a person. I couldn't see any path forward that didn't involve giving up everything I believed about right and wrong. You reminded me that how we respond to hardship defines who we are more than the hardship itself." Emma squeezed his hand gently, her eyes bright with emotion but steady with determination. "Then you know what you have to do," she said simply. "You have to be the man you choose to be, regardless of what Tom Bradley or anyone else might do." In response, as evening settled around the cottage and they prepared another simple meal together, Jake felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected gift of Emma's presence in his life. In the space of 24 hours, she had transformed his understanding of his own situation from one of hopeless defeat to one of meaningful choice. The challenges ahead remained formidable, and the risks were real and serious. But he was no longer facing them alone, and he was no longer fighting simply for survival. He was fighting for the kind of future that good people deserve to have, a future where integrity mattered more than wealth, where justice was available to everyone, regardless of their social status, and where love could grow even in the most unlikely circumstances. It was a future worth risking everything to protect, and Jake knew that come morning, he would begin the dangerous work of making that future possible. 3 days later, as the first snow of winter began to dust the hills around Cedar Falls, Jake rode toward the abandoned line shack where he suspected Bradley was holding Mrs. Morrison's stolen cattle. The morning air bit sharp against his face, but his resolve remained steady despite the isolation of his mission. Emma had insisted, unpacking provisions for his journey, her gentle hands preparing supplies that spoke of care, extending far beyond mere hospitality. The canyon opened before him exactly as he remembered, a natural fortress surrounded by rocky walls that provided both shelter and concealment. As Jake approached the rim, he could hear the unmistakable sound of cattle moving in the valley below. Through careful observation from behind a cluster of boulders, he confirmed what he had suspected: 30 head of prime beef cattle bearing Mrs. Morrison's brand, guarded by 2 armed men who clearly weren't expecting visitors. Jake was preparing to retreat and report his findings to Sheriff Roberts when the sound of approaching horses made him freeze. Tom Bradley himself rode into the canyon, accompanied by 3 additional men whose hard faces and ready weapons identified them as hired guns rather than ranch hands. Their conversation carried clearly in the cold air, and what Jake heard made his blood run cold. "We'll move them tonight," Bradley was saying. "The buyer in San Antonio is expecting delivery by week's end, and I want this business concluded before anyone starts asking uncomfortable questions." "What about Mitchell?" one of the gunmen asked. "Word is he's been sniffing around, asking questions about missing cattle." Bradley's laugh was harsh and devoid of humor. "Jake Mitchell is finished in this county. After tonight, he'll be too busy dealing with his own problems to worry about anyone else's livestock." Jake felt ice form in his stomach as he realized that Bradley not only knew about his investigation, but was planning some form of retaliation. The implication was clear: whatever Bradley had in mind would be designed to discredit or eliminate Jake as a threat to his operations. The conversation continued below, revealing the scope of Bradley's criminal enterprises. The cattle theft was just one element of a larger operation that included land fraud, illegal gambling, and protection schemes targeting smaller ranchers throughout the region. Bradley had systematically used his wealth and connections to build a network of corruption that touched every aspect of life in Cedar Falls. As Jake prepared to withdraw from his hiding place, disaster struck. His horse, spooked by a sudden gust of wind, whinnied loudly and shifted position, sending loose rocks cascading down the canyon wall. The sound immediately alerted Bradley's men, who began scanning the rim for intruders. "Someone's up there," one of them shouted, pointing directly at Jake's position. Jake had no choice but to run. He spurred his horse toward the canyon mouth, but Bradley's men were already mounting up in pursuit. The chase that followed was desperate and dangerous, with bullets whining past Jake's head as he pushed his mount to its limits across the broken terrain. The pursuit led directly back towards Cedar Falls, and Jake realized with growing horror that he was inadvertently drawing Bradley's violence toward the very people he was trying to protect. As he approached Emma's cottage, he could see smoke rising from the chimney and knew she was inside, unaware of the danger racing toward her. Jake made a split-second decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of continuing past the cottage to draw his pursuers away, he wheeled his horse toward Emma's door, shouting a warning as Bradley's men thundered into the yard behind him. "Emma, get down!" Jake yelled as he threw himself from his horse and rushed toward the cottage door. The first bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around but not stopping his forward momentum. The second bullet, aimed at his back as he shielded Emma's doorway with his body, struck him in the side, sending him to his knees on the cottage porch. Emma emerged from the house just as Jake collapsed, her face white with terror as she saw the blood spreading across his shirt. Without hesitation, she positioned herself between Jake and Bradley's approaching gunmen, her hands spread protectively over her pregnant belly as she stared down the barrels of their weapons. "Stop!" Sheriff Roberts' voice boomed across the yard as he and his deputies arrived, drawn by the sound of gunfire. "Drop your weapons and step back." The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive. Faced with official law enforcement and the testimony of multiple witnesses, Bradley's men surrendered without further violence. Bradley himself attempted to claim that Jake had been trespassing on his property and stealing his cattle, but Jake's weak but clear testimony about what he had observed in the canyon provided the evidence Sheriff Roberts needed to make arrests. As Dr. Collins worked to treat Jake's wounds in Emma's cottage, the full scope of Bradley's criminal network began to unravel. Other victims came forward with stories of fraud and intimidation, and a careful search of Bradley's properties revealed evidence of multiple illegal enterprises. The man who had seemed untouchable due to his wealth and connections found himself facing charges that would ensure he never threatened honest ranchers again. Jake's recovery was slow but steady, aided by Emma's devoted care and the knowledge that his sacrifice had protected not only her, but the entire community from Bradley's predatory schemes. Mrs. Morrison's cattle were returned to her ranch, and she formally offered Jake the position of ranch manager, with partnership opportunities that would allow him to rebuild his life on solid foundations. On a crisp December morning, as Emma's labor pains began and Dr. Collins was summoned to assist with the birth, Jake realized that his journey from despair to redemption was complete. The child who entered the world that day would grow up in a community where justice prevailed and good people looked out for each other. Emma named their son Thomas after her late husband, but she gave him Jake's surname, making official the bond that had formed between two broken souls who had found healing in each other's company. The wedding that followed was simple but joyous, attended by grateful neighbors who understood that love forged in adversity often proved stronger than any other kind. As Jake held his newborn son and looked into Emma's radiant face, he understood that sometimes losing everything was simply the first step toward finding what truly mattered. Honor couldn't be stolen or sold, love couldn't be bought or corrupted, and courage was measured not by what a person had, but by what they were willing to sacrifice for others. The cottage that had once sheltered a desperate stranger became the foundation of a new family, and the man who had wept in the rain became the protector of everything worth protecting. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.